Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. I've gone for a rather philosophical book bag for this week's discussion. It's a quote from Cicero. If you have a library and a garden, you have everything you need. That was certainly pretty crucial during lockdown. And I've picked that because I think we're going to be having a fairly philosophical conversation ranging over many interesting topics with my next guest, the author, the psychotherapist, possibly even the philosopher, Mark Vernon. Welcome, Mark, into the book bag.
Hey, Suzi, thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Well, I say you're a philosopher. You are indeed the in-house philosopher for the Idler, are you not?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. So I think I did do a philosophy PhD. I'm not an academic philosopher, but the Idler strapline is philosophy, husbandry, and merriment. And the Idler were good at accessing husbandry and merriment. And so I got brought along to provide some philosophical input as well. It's philosophy in the sense of, how do we live, what's going on, rather than analysis and logic.
Yes, it's you do things like every month. I think there's a sort of update on things to look out for in the heavens, for example.
Yeah, so a bit of natural philosophy. I like that, as physics and astronomy were called, but also particularly the ancient philosophers. You mentioned Cicero there, beloved by idlers, and also bringing in the psychological as well. Partly because of my work as a psychotherapist, and so sort of slightly harking back to the pre-20th century when psychology and philosophy and theology and even what we now call the natural sciences were fairly tightly interwoven, bringing that together.
Yeah, I think you've sort of been interesting things, studied interesting things. You seem to have had a very unique kind of career development. And I was just looking at some of the books that you have written, a secret history of Christianity, the Idler Guide to Ancient Philosophy. Obviously we've touched on that. And we're going to be talking more about your book on Dante, most of all, your book on Dante. Is it correct that you were formerly a priest?
Yeah, so my career development, as you nicely put it, my wandering and wanderings, what on earth I was doing, did include a curacy, as it's called in the Church of England. So that's the kind of apprenticeship period after you become a priest. But it fell apart for me, and I didn't continue that. Although I'm still very religious now, so hence partly interest in things like Dante and the Divine Comedy.
And you have a degree in physics, is that correct?
Yeah, so that was the undergraduate beginning, a degree in physics, mostly because, well, actually, for a long time I was told at school I couldn't write. And so I did lots of sciences with a bit of music on the side. And it wasn't until I actually did the training as a priest, and so I had to write theology essays, that I found out I could write. But the silver cloud, the silver lining in that cloud was that I did do a physics degree, which I wasn't very good at, but it at least gave me a sort of felt sense of the sciences, which I've subsequently been glad of, actually.
And how did you get on to ancient philosophy from that?
Well, that came when I left the church, and it was quite a crisis time. And so I went back to the ancient Greeks, really to try and find a worldview, and particularly turn to Plato. And that kind of got me back on track, at least as I would see it. Some people might see it was even more mistaken, but nonetheless.
So it wasn't just a kind of period of study, it's sort of self-study as well, and looking to see, what you can apply to your own situation, I guess.
Yeah, very much. I did the PhD not full-time, part-time, when I was working as a journalist, and which I did after I left the church. And it was very much a kind of personal quest as well as an academic qualification. And I, in retrospect, I was never really going to become an academic. I didn't do it for that reason. I did it to try and dive deeply into Plato, kind of use the discipline of a PhD to do that.
And what about how did all of that bring you to the Idler? I mean, how did you meet? I presume you met Tom, who has himself been in the book bag.
Yeah, so we met, and I've been doing a lot of business and technology journalism. In fact, when I first left the church, mostly because at that time there was a lot of that kind of journalism to do, and because I had this physics degree, people think that means that you might know something about technology, which isn't necessarily the case. But anyway, it got me going in that area. And but I wanted to write more broadly and indeed speak and talk about things more philosophical, psychological, and so on. And so meeting Tom and Victoria at the Idler, when they were setting up, they had a shop which included classes. And so I joined when they opened that up and started teaching, and then writing for the magazine. And they've been really, really important to me in terms of, encouraging me, but also giving me a bit of a platform to write.
And also, I mean, coming up is the Idler Festival. I think we're both going to be, I'm pretty sure I'm speaking at that or interviewing somebody at that, and you'll be there as well. What are you doing this year?
Well, I shall do a philosophy walk, which is an excuse to step out into another bit of the beautiful gardens of Fenton House, and we have a kind of chat about something or other. And then also I'm doing what we call a philosophy slam with my colleague Robert Rowland Smith, and there we stand up, people call out words to us, sometimes witty, sometimes a bit more serious, and then we riff on those words, philosophically, psychologically, and it can be sort of fun, it can be illuminating, and hopefully entertaining as well.
I'm remembering something from quite a few years back. I was interviewing Alain de Botton on stage, and he slightly rashly said, I will answer your problems, in lieu of the normal question time at the end. And the first question was something so unbelievably difficult and convoluted that he just said, I'm afraid I can't help with that one. Just have to move on. So
yeah, well, the good thing about calling it a slam is that as long as you disguise your bridges, you can more or less go off in whatever direction you choose. So yeah. Don't answer problems, but just offer a few thoughts.
Yeah, indeed. And as a psychotherapist, I mean, you do have to address issues and problems. How did that come about?
Well, partly it was personal. I was in quite a state really when I left the church, and so I went into psychotherapy myself, but was always interested in it. I think partly from the link with ancient philosophy, actually, because an assumption back then was that if you want to know about something, you have to know about yourself as well. Because if you've got limitations, that will limit what you can resonate with, what you can see. And so ancient philosophy was much more like, I think, modern psychotherapy than it's like modern philosophy, where the assumption is a bit like in the sciences, the person doing the philosophy sort of shouldn't matter. Whereas I think it deeply does matter, actually. In fact, I think it matters in the sciences as well, but that's another story.
Is there that idea that there's the macrocosm and the microcosm, that you can't remove yourself from everything that's around you?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. That knowing was thought primarily to be a kind of communion or participation. What resonated within you, the microcosm, was some kind of reflection of what was resonating within an enchanted cosmos. And so tuning in, aligning, the virtues mattering, for example, that was all part of it. And so if you personally have kind of blocks or difficulties, that's going to constrain your vision. And so hence in psychotherapy, it's not really about solving problems, but it is trying to work with things that are limiting, and seeing what new things might therefore emerge.
It's very much pertinent to Dante as he makes his way through the three realms of the Divine Comedy, that what he experiences and sees and thinks is a reflection of his limitations. it's one of the themes that you bring out in your book. All the time he's saying, look, I really did this. I did go to hell. I did go to purgatory. I did even get this glimpse of heaven. But it's such an interesting, before we get on to the Dante book, I just thought I'd make that point, that his limitations, I mean, he only seems to see Florentines at one point, you know, which I think is incredibly funny. You get the impression that, you know, if I went to hell, I'd meet people from Bolton or something, you know.
Yeah, no, well, it's, you know, it's a bit like a dream. Your dreams are populated by the people you've encountered, either because you know them personally or because they're sort of big in your mind, celebrities or whoever else it might be. And that's very much what happens to Dante. And I think this business about going to hell and purgatory and the paradise is very much about him having to tune in to those states of mind. And then that whole aspect of reality shows up in his mind. That's one way of understanding it. So he has to become kind of hellish in order to go to hell and understand how that's part of him. Yeah, so it is very psychological. But I think, you know, for Dante, it wasn't just what was going on inside his head. It was also this microcosm, macrocosm element as well. So that's not to say that he didn't feel he actually visited hell and purgatory and paradise.
I mean, there's the great story about people pointing at him in the street going, there he goes, the man he went to hell. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's so vivid. It's very easy to, I mean, it haunts the Western imagination, doesn't it? To this day, I think we have this feeling that is what hell is like. Because,
well, I wanted to get into the Divine Comedy because it felt like this, I know it's in the top 3 books in Western Christianity, say, and as you say, people still talk about the circles of hell being reserved for your worst enemy, and but also, you know, I was very clear I wanted to consider the purgatory and the paradise as well, because, you know, when he gets to the edge of paradise, Dante actually says, in one of these ways that he breaks the fourth wall, as you've said, talks to us, his readers, and says, you know, this is actually really the beginning of my journey, and in brackets, our journey. He's always clear that this isn't just about his reflections, but is an invitation to follow him as well. And he writes for the future. I think he does write for our times. He's not really the grand flourishing of a dying medieval worldview. He knew that things were changing in his time, and so wants to write to propel himself, but also aid us in this future.
Well, I want to move back a little bit, and we'll get on to more Dante shortly. But what was the first book that you wrote? You, the boy who was told he couldn't write at all. What was the first book?
It was actually a business book, and it was a good one to write because it was for a series. Some of the books I've done have been for series, and you know, if you're a journalist, you get a reputation as being able to write, to deliver word counts on deadline and so on, and that, you know, for publishers that matters quite as much as anything else. And so the first book I did was off the back of freelancing in this business and technology area. It was for Routledge. They had a series called The Key Concepts, and I did business, the key concepts. So it's a kind of dictionary style, well, longer entries than just dictionary entries, but it meant that I could hunker down in the British Library and you know, just research and write it. It was good experience because it did give me a sense of what it was like to produce, I don't know if it was 70,000 words or something. And that, you know, gave me a sense of how to pace yourself when writing books.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we're so used to writing 1,000 words, 2,000 words, 500 words, or whatever. It's the real, you know, it's the marathon, isn't it? Having to write something sort of that long with a much longer deadline, one imagines. Although maybe Routledge, because it was part of a series, maybe they were a little bit tougher than somebody else might have been. What did you move on to after that?
Then I think the next one was a book about friendship, because the PhD I'd done on Plato was really about the role of friendship in Plato's philosophy. And so the journalistic part of me had gathered loads of stuff on friendship, I'd realized or hoped that there was a bit of a gap in the market here, because there's loads of books about family love, about romantic love, but actually to this day, I think actually not really many about friendship, although most people would say friendship probably is the love that matters more than any to them. And so I wrote the book called The Meaning of Friendship, which was looking at partly what philosophers have said about it, but trying to think about the then new phenomenon of the internet, for example, that kind of impact upon friendship in politics, this sort of strange thing that we have now, that friendship is almost wholly a private relationship, whereas, for most of human history, it's been a public relationship as well. And so trying to highlight how friendship matters, but is also quite difficult. Things like it doesn't have a natural shape. If you fall in love, then, whether or not you end up getting married, there is that kind of commitment, marriage sort of shape. Even when the relationship breaks up, there's a kind of divorce-like shape you can follow. And friendship, though, doesn't have that kind of patterning. And I think people like it for that reason. It feels free. But then it can also be quite confusing. And, what do you do if you fall out with friends, and all these kind of questions I wanted to ask.
Did you take a historical view of friendship? Because it does seem to have changed. If you look at, say, male friendships in the Victorian era, they can be extraordinarily passionate in a way that seems rather suggestive to us, but doesn't. I'm thinking about Tennyson and Arthur Hallam. They seem to have sort of very intense relationships that we might now view in a different way, but Victorians might have thought, no, that's what male friendships are,
Yeah, no, I agree. Again, in Shakespeare, men are always saying "I love you" to each other, which, I don't know, maybe in more recent years, men particularly have felt freer to say. But I think that part of what has happened is the identification of homosexuality as opposed to heterosexuality, which has a history too. The word homosexuality is a late 19th century word, late Victorian word. And I think that the surfacing of that caused a bit of a crisis, really, in male friendships in particular. This famous remark about lesbianism didn't really exist in Victoria's mind. But I think that there's been a kind of renegotiation, therefore, of affection between men, which actually, I think has changed even in recent decades. And so affection between men has become freer again, as homosexuality has become less taboo.
Yeah. And then the other kind of thing about modern friendships is that you have this idea that you can banish people or not get on with people because of, say, one belief that they have that you don't share, or one position that they've adopted. I suppose this is a social media thing where people say, I couldn't possibly be friends with somebody who thinks that. That's rather extreme, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, just recently, I've been rather persuaded by an argument made by Robin Dunbar, who's a professor of evolutionary psychology. And one of the things which he's known for is called Dunbar's number. And it's the idea that you can only have relationships with a certain number of people in the sense of knowing them as people, as individuals. And he reckons it's about 150. And that once we
exceed that,
well, maybe, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But certainly it's limited. And so the point when it comes to social media is that on social media, you're kind of forced to have one-on-one interactions, at least, with people that you don't know personally, you can't possibly know personally. And so you resort to stereotypes. And stereotypes then get this very, you're either in or out, you're either friend or not. And so the single issue determines whether you feel animosity or enmity.
Right.
Yeah, so I think I found that very persuasive, actually, the way that social media kind of collapses a distance between us that's actually quite helpful. We have our kind of circle of friends, and then that models in the old world how we could be friendly towards others. But when there's all sorts of intrusions into that inner circle because of social media, it gets very confusing. and you
Mm.
have to draw on
Mm.
assumptions and stereotypes, and of course they're quite inclined to divide.
I went to an event last night at the Stationers Hall, one of the livery companies that is really, in the modern world, it's about communication now, not just people who sell pens, although that is a part of the Stationers company as well. And actually that conversation did arise that it's really good to meet in person and to have a venue where people who are from different walks of life and who do different things can just get together with that kind of clubbable atmosphere, if you like. It seems sort of slightly at risk in the modern world, doesn't it?
Yeah, although maybe after the pandemic, another recent factor, we're wanting that personal encounter again because the experience is richer. We communicate in all sorts of ways, of course, not just through words. Even the music of our words conveys a lot, and that's just a lot easier when you're in person.
And also, I mean, to a certain degree, social conventions mean that you can't, I mean, some of the awful things people say on social media could not possibly be said somewhere like the Stationers Hall, or that something sort of keeps you in check, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, in psychotherapy, there's a notion of what's called object relations theory, and the idea is that our psyches are full of like personalities and sub-personalities that we've taken in. I mean, the classic example would be there's a sort of bit of a father-shaped personality inside my head because of that relationship, and a mother-shaped one, but all sorts of other experiences can get internalized in that way, and particularly partial experiences, which are the ones that tend to be more traumatic, or maybe affirming as well, where the emotion itself, rather than the complexity of a person, the fullness of a person, gets internalized. And so those part objects are the ones that tend to shout loudest when we're in a rather part objecty, fragmented kind of environment like social media, where all you have is a limited number of words, not knowing anything about the person behind them. And so that tends to provoke these more primitive, as a psychotherapist would say, responses, and hence the sort of sense that things can spiral down if you're not careful.
Are you a particular sort of psychotherapist? I mean, there are different labels to psychotherapy, aren't there? Is a particular branch that you are in?
Not really now. I mean, I did what was called a psychodynamic psychotherapy training, which is what happened after Freud, particularly in the UK. So figures like Donald Winnicott, Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, Wilfred Bion. If you're into psychotherapy, these figures were really important. We read their books and learned from their followers. And something like object relations comes from that period as well. But the minute you start working in practice, it's really the encounters with particular individuals that matter, and then different ideas are more useful in certain contexts than others, with certain people than others, and really the driving imperative is to try and see what elicits movement or freedom or change. So you're not seeking to analyze the person, saying they've got this complex or that condition, but ideas from that kind of approach might be useful, because they seem to prompt a shift or an illumination. So the short answer is that I think most practicing psychotherapists are quite eclectic, actually.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, where are we generally with Freud? Is he useful, partially useful, a bit old hat, utterly foundational? What is he?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of his theories, he's a bit old hat. And in fact, Freud himself is one of these people that his own ideas changed at least 3 times through the course of his life. But he was a brilliant writer. In fact, he won prizes for his writing rather than for his science. He won the Goethe Prize in Germany. And so there's something about the spirit of his writing that is still very energizing. You don't have to believe it to get the energy from it. And so in a psychotherapy training, you will read Freud, not because you believe in penis envy or whatever, but because these are very vivid sort of notions, and they kind of release a way of engaging with inner life that is still valuable because of the energy rather than because of the specifics. If nothing else, it makes you realize that inner life matters and it's powerful and it's alive.
Yes. Did you do much, or do you do much dream analysis? I mean, you mentioned earlier on what's in our dreams. It's very personal to us. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, no, I think dreams can be very illuminating, both personally as well as when working with someone else. You can't force the issue, but when a dream comes up, it's always worth paying attention to. Sometimes I think dreams are fairly understandable reflections on the previous day, with a bit of a twist or a jumble, driven by fears or hopes that you're fairly familiar with already. But every so often a dream carries a slightly more, Jung would say, numinous quality, or it just sort of feels like it matters somehow, and it's an image that is worth holding on to and returning to, because it is trying to communicate something.
Yeah, sometimes they have that strange feeling of coming from elsewhere, or telling you something that I suppose is the unconscious an interesting idea? Isn't it sort of threefold? Is there an unconscious and a subconscious and something on top? That's Freudian, isn't it? I don't really know.
People have kind of characterized the unconscious. I like to think of it more as just what we're not conscious of. So there's dynamics around us when we're awake that we're unconscious of, but still can be quite influential. And then you've got things like subliminal messaging coming in. But there's a sort of more personal side to our life that we're less conscious of, which are things that have happened to us, but for one reason or another, we've lost direct contact with. But perhaps it's quite easy to access that. But then if you're more inclined towards Jung, which I am now, certainly when it comes to what's unconscious, Jung also felt that we inherited parts of our psyche. He was very influenced by Darwin, and reasons that if I've got 5 fingers on each hand because of our fish ancestor that had 5 bones in a fin or whatever it might be, so too our psyches are inherited, evolutionarily speaking, and so have a certain structure or patterning that shows up in our lives. The way that imagination and reason, for example, relate must be to do with what were originally maybe instincts and planning that other animals exhibit too, but with more maybe nuance or of course we're not just conscious, like I'm sure most animals are, but we're self-conscious, so we can reflect on the fact that we're conscious as well, which I'm not sure many other animals can, in fact. But anyway, yeah, so what we're unconscious of has a number of layers.
What I find fascinating to return to Dante is how his model of the universe and the world and the mind is so different from us now, and yet how is it that it feels so real and it feels so meaningful to us? How can he describe human beings in such a way that all our models of the mind have changed, and yet he's almost our contemporary still? What do you put that down to?
Well, I think that's one of the ways in which he is a modern writer. He does actually use the word modern in a modern sense. The word modern but I think Cicero invented it, actually, now I think of it. But anyway, it's an ancient word, but he used it in the modern sense of kind of looking to the future, which is part of what we mean by modernity. And so he's he's one of the figures that helped seed the Renaissance. He was a contemporary of Giotto, and in art, Giotto's known for portraits that look like real people rather than sort of types of people.
Expressions and drama and emotions.
And so Dante, a poet, not a theologian, writing in Italian or Florentine Italian, not Latin. So all these ways in which the particular started to matter at the beginning of the Renaissance period, Dante's part of. And that includes, I think, personal psychology. A lot of what goes on in the Divine Comedy does relate to what we would now call personal psychology. And he's one of the figures that begins to work that out. I mean, Jung makes this comment that the gods have become diseases. And I think part of what he meant was where in pre-modern times, people would have talked about the influences that they felt in terms of gods and spirits and so on around them. We now talk about them as if they're our own possession, they're parts of ourselves. And so when Dante thinks about what it means to be in a hellish state of mind, say, he uses what we would call aspects of psychology. I mean, it is very remarkable, actually. I mentioned object relations. At one point in the Purgatory, he actually talks about how young kids love everything, and so they reach out and want to grab and take in everything. And that's not just a physical action, but is a psychological action as well. Only some things that they take in hurt them, and so they form a model of the world that then is rather inclined to shape their experience of life as they get older. And unless you ask yourself about the model of the world that's got set up inside you, you're only ever going to really relate to that model of the world. And so it's going to limit you. And so part of what happens in Purgatory is your model of the world is called into question. And that is a very, very remarkable modern sounding way of dealing with things. But of course, Freud and these great thinkers, they all read Dante. And so, there is a conversation going on between them.
Is it true to say, would it be true to say that the people that are in hell because they don't yet accept that they're in the wrong? I mean, the thing about Purgatory is some of the things that people are undergoing in Purgatory look like the torments of hell, but they're so much more positive about it, which is why it's Purgatory and not hell.
I think that's right, but with the extra twist that those who are in the lower circles of hell know they've done wrong and want to keep doing wrong. The darkness deepens the more in the upper circles of hell. There's a kind of ignorance or a mistake that people have made that traps them. So like the circle of the lustful, they've fallen in love with one person, but made the mistake of thinking that can satisfy them forever. And so sure enough, they're with their beloved in the circle of the lustful together forever, but it's become a kind of torture. But that's a lesser evil. It's just a kind of mistake. But as you go lower down, and things like fraudulence and deviousness and things like usury, actually, things that people know are kind of screwing their neighbor, but they want to keep to that way of life. And so that's a deeper way of being bound by evil. Whereas in Purgatory, as you're saying, people are very aware of their vices, but they recognize them as vices, and that they want, therefore, to work on themselves to be released from that. And so the suffering changes. It becomes not exactly always welcome, but at least they know that it's the way forward to try and understand how they've trapped themselves. And they also always see the light. In Purgatory there's day and night, whereas in hell is a kind of perpetual darkness. And so there's a sense of transience and movement. The present moment exists in Purgatory, and the present moment doesn't really exist in hell. It's all the past, being terrified or sort of bound to the past. Whereas in the important thing about the present moment is that we change in the present moment, and so change becomes possible.
It's interesting, isn't it, that I think the demons begin halfway down hell, roughly speaking. I mean, in the upper reaches of hell, people are just, stuck with like the Wood of the Suicides, for example, they're stuck in their situation. I think there are harpies actually in the Wood of the Suicides, but the real malevolence is in the Malbolgia, isn't it, where the devils arrive and we get the pitchforks and all the prodding and the torturing and all that kind of thing. The upper reaches of hell, people are kind of they haven't sinned as badly, let's say.
Yeah, you're right that I mean there are sort of devils that cajoling people and mocking people and frightening people and so on. But the lower you go, the more, well, actually, not just the more that devils and the human souls are locked in battles and squabbles and so on, but even the blurring between what is a human soul and what's a devil starts happening as well. I mean, in the lowest regions of hell, and Dante again is very perceptive here. I think that what erodes your humanity also means that you lose your personality. You go kind of crazy, and what's within you and what's outside of you, you lose the capacity to distinguish between those things. You become sort of porous in a terrible way, and so the bodies of people in the lower circles of hell become kind of sort of blurred with the ground or the ice. The center of hell for Dante is frozen solid and all a kind of absolute zero, almost falling out of being altogether. And so, again, it's a sort of Platonic understanding that who we are is very much shaped by what we are. And so if what you are becomes more and more deformed, who you are becomes deformed as well. And that's so Dante encounters that lower and lower down, and so the difference between a demon and a human just gets harder to tell.
When you came across Dante, was that part of your training in psychotherapy? I mean, how would you encountered him?
Yeah, it wasn't, but actually the way that the Divine Comedy came to life was partly through my own psychoanalysis. So I had a period of quite intense psychoanalysis. And I sort of got stuck really in it, but I was then part of a reading group that was reading the Divine Comedy with a very good teacher over quite a period of time, and there was something about the dynamic, particularly in the purgatory, that really helped me actually in my own analysis. Partly what we were just saying, actually, that if you can attend to the present moment, then the things that frighten you from the past can gradually lose their grip, and then a pull to a different future becomes possible. And it wasn't so much that I saw myself on Mount Purgatory, but there was something about the dynamic that really helped me. And so my sort of love of the Divine Comedy stems from there, but then also because of it felt real to me in this slightly subtler way, not just I'm a sort of great believer in hell or whatever, but in this slightly subtler way, I wanted to keep reading it. Yeah. And so I've read it, many times now.
Do you have a favorite translation?
Well, the one that I recommend, and I do feel very warmly towards it, is one of the ones in Penguin Classics, which is by Mark Muser. And it's a really good translation because it majors on being accessible. It keeps the sort of the structure of the Divine Comedy, particularly the three lines of the terza rima that Dante's famous for, but doesn't try and do the rhyming itself, which is very difficult to do in English. Dorothy L. Sayers, her translation is in the Penguin Classics as well, and she was able to do the terza rima with the rhyming. A really successful translation, actually. I read that her translation, which came out just after the Second World War, sold 1 million copies. Can you believe? It must have really spoken to the times.
Yeah.
But Mark Muses is a good one, and he also has enough footnotes to tell you what's going on without flooding you. So it's a good one that I constantly return to. But then you want to get, probably 2 or 3 others if you don't read the Italian, which I don't.
Yeah.
To get a better sense of what's going on.
It's quite good to read too, I think. And I think if you're going to read the sayers, it's quite good to read. So I think there's one in Everyman that is kind of blank verse. So it still has a sort of poetry feel to it, but without the rhyme, which, as you say, is difficult. And then you look and see how Sayers has done it. And I think she has a very good strike rate. I mean, one of the episodes that I love actually is the one with Brunetto Latini, one of the great moments in the Inferno. And reading your take on it, you have quite an unusual take, actually.
Yeah, well,
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's one of the places where if you go for a kind of Inferno 101, then this is the pattern, this is the structure. So when Dante's in X circle, why sin is being addressed. I think that when he encounters Bruno Latini, this is one of the places where that is clearly, to my mind, just not really working. And so in the circle where they meet Bruno Latini, who was a teacher of Dante, it's normally talked about as being the circle of the Sodomites, because, partly because earlier in the Inferno, Aristotelian understandings of vices and so on had come up. Virgil had explained that to Dante, and so the patterning seems to be following that kind of guise. But I think that what Dante does is he kind of gives you a map that gets you going, but as we say now, the territory is not the map. And so you've got to be constantly revising your map if you're actually to stay in touch with what's really going on. And in particular in this canto, although many introductions will call it, an encounter with sodomy, in the canto itself, to my mind, this is absolutely no indications of sodomy. There's like one vague metaphor that seems a bit phallic, but that's about it. And although, the love between master and student, which, in a traditional teacher setting can have kind of the homoerotic overtones, and who knows, maybe Bruno Latini was, had male lovers or something. It feels to me that something else is going on by the time you actually get there, which is much more about the respect for a teacher, but the risk of adulating a teacher, and so confusing that your love of them for what the teaching itself might communicate to you, the love of the subject and the love of the revelation. And so it feels to me that just trying desperately to look for signs of sodomy in Canto kind of misses the main point.
Yes, he's the final image, which I find tremendously moving. He runs as if he's taking part in one of those kind of medieval celebrations. He's running to catch hold of the flag or whatever, and he looks like the winning runner, not the losing runner. But you're a little bit skeptical at that point of what that actually means, aren't you? I was interested to see that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for reading it so carefully. I'm trying to remember what I say now, but as it comes back to me now, I think that this is
when you were talking about fame.
Yeah, and so this is the mistake of the great teacher or famous person, that they think they've got it. They think they've kind of won the race. They've run the race and won it. Whereas the whole point for Dante, time and time again, is that everything we learn is but a guide or a suggestion as to the greater glory, the divine revelation. And so it's particularly for Dante, who's clearly a genius writer, there's a constant struggle with not confusing his genius with the genius he's actually trying to write about, which is a great temptation. And even for lesser writers, you want to feel you've sort of got it right when you write, but if you feel you've therefore got it, period, when you write, then you've actually cut yourself off. And so you might be feeling you've run the race well, but you might be missing the whole point, actually.
It's kind of the ultimate sin, really, throughout the Divine Comedy, that the level to which you have cut yourself off from however we determine, the Godhead. In hell, you're absolutely cut off. In purgatory, you're making your way back. In paradise, there is this, the full realization, the full contact. Which was the most difficult to write about? You always think paradise is quite tough conceptually, and in terms of a read, it is quite tough, isn't it?
Yeah. All three canticles have their difficulties. All of them, for example, there's this kind of very complex layering that Dante goes in for, not just of the figures that he encounters, but he draws on Christian stories, Christian theology, but also other mythologies. And so the layering of that, what on earth's going on here, is a constant question. But I think that he wants you to work at it because he wants it to be realized in you. And once you get enough of a handle on what's going on, then the lovely thing is it keeps opening up to you because of this layering. So the inspiration comes through. But I mean, one of the big difficulties in the Paradise, actually, for me, was the structure of planetary spheres. 2/3 of it or something is them, Dante and Beatrice, now traveling through, first of all, the lunar sphere, and then Mercury and Venus and the Sun, and then Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, and then the fixed stars and the Prima Mobile. Because at first pass, this is a model of the cosmos that, just doesn't stack up very well today, if you treat it in a fairly literal way. But the way I kind of wrestled with it was that, actually, even in the Paradise, although initially they go up, very quickly it's not going up that's stress, but going into. So Dante, as it were, learns the lessons of one sphere, and then they find themselves quite spontaneously in the next sphere. And so I interpreted this as playing on the notion of light, that light is both an external thing, but even now in the modern world, light is still an inner thing. You say, I had a light bulb moment, or I felt enlightened, and even your mind does feel brighter when you get something, as opposed to feeling dark or lost. And so I think that the different qualities of the planetary lights correspond to different kinds of light that we might feel inside of us. And so it teases out how we come to love and know things more and more fully. And so the Paradise is a lot about Beatrice sort of guiding, but almost titrating qualities of light into Dante through her smile, through her eyes, through the music. The great thing about a smile on someone's face, say, is that it's not just a symbol of something that's joyful, say, but is a sharing in that joyfulness. And that's one of the things that makes the Paradise so distinctive. And I think once you've got a handle on things in that way, it actually relates very directly to our experience still. And so stops being this, kind of difficult, abstract thing. But it's still challenging, though. One of the things about the Paradise is that it's not just undifferentiated bliss. Dante says it's the beginning of the journey, really. Everything else was a preparation. And he says to us readers, if you don't follow me now, you're going to get very lost, in a way that perhaps is even more devastating than being lost earlier on.
In the dark wood.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, it is challenging, but I actually, one of the things which I checked when I'd written my book was that I more or less written equal amounts on the Inferno, on the Purgatory, on the Paradise, because I wanted to say that the Paradise really matters. It's not just something we can't really believe in anymore. We've got to make some sense of it. And so I'm really keen on that.
Had you managed it? Had you written roughly equal?
It did turn out that way, yes.
Right. Yeah, because the structure is a chapter on each canto, And some are longer than others. Some need a bit more explanation as to what's going on, and some are quite brisk, you know, especially in the Inferno. I mean, Virgil, who is the guide, does quite often say, come on, you know, don't hang about, don't talk to them, we've got to go.
Yeah. No, well, because Dante, you know, has to become a bit infernal to be in the Inferno. Sometimes he can handle that. Like he doesn't, Dante, the person, doesn't seem to have had much of a problem with anger. He can kind of encounter anger. He can get angry, but it doesn't kind of consume him. Whereas lust, for example, he collapses when they enter the circle of the lustful. That was clearly a big thing. And so, but Virgil's always on the lookout for how Dante's being affected. And sometimes, you know, some things are just easier to understand for us now. Whereas, you know, other moments just aren't. So you have to do a bit of unpacking. And then, you know, like we were talking with Bruno Latini, I wanted to constantly make this point that this is a reflexive text. It's not just like a map. You know, and I think that to read it in that way is to miss the point.
I think one of the big misconceptions is that it's just about, you know, this is a text about 14th century theology. And it kind of put me off for a long time. I mean, obviously we know about hell and the rings of hell and so on and so forth. But I think I thought I was going to have to tackle scholastic philosophy to make any kind of sense of the Divine Comedy, and that's not the case at all. I mean, you could argue that it's a kind of video game, even, or a fantasy novel, or a kind of Lord of the Rings, which also has a tripartite structure, of course. You know, you can read it in so many different ways, can't you?
Yeah, and there's always action. I mean, you know, the good thing that it's all told through encounters. There's never a moment where they're not about to see someone, or speaking with someone, or running from someone, or moving. And although, you know, at various points, like Virgil might give a talk, or they might meet someone else that gives them a bit of a talk, or Beatrice, certainly, you know, it's intelligence as well as love that drives the passage through the paradise. But yeah, there's always a kind of context, and this sense of something is unfolding, or something new is emerging. So yeah, and this is the terza rima form, you know, in the Italian, that carries that sense of pulse and moving forwards. So, you know, you can read it in different ways. Some people do read it very theologically, others read it very historically. But certainly I was interested in how Dante changes, and so how we can monitor those changes in ourselves and go with them too. That was the way I wanted to read it.
How you came up with the idea of writing a book about Dante, because he has been very extensively discussed and analysed over the centuries. Did you have your own kind of light bulb moment of, I can write about this in a new way?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I hope so. And it was, though, really because the book spoke to me because of my own struggles. And so, you know, I didn't want to do a reception history. I didn't want to do a scholarly literary analysis, or even a theological, you know, analysis. I did want to, well, I called it the spiritual journey. And you know, Dante does actually tell us that this is what the book's about. And it's all those other things as well. But perhaps because of the way that modern academic life has gone, and it's mostly academics that do write about the Divine Comedy, there's plenty of that other stuff, the reception history and so on, what it means in the late medieval context, the, you know, the literary side, the linguistic side, all that. But yeah, strangely, it is quite hard to find a book that majors on the change, what's actually going on for Dante, and why that might matter to us as individuals now.
It's very visual. It's extraordinary in terms of the compression of the writing and the vividness of, you know, he makes you see things in your mind's eye, for sure. But what about artistic depictions of the comedy. Do you have a favourite artist?
Yeah, I mean, actually, my favourite artist may be a living illustrator, the illustrator Monica Beisner, who did a complete set of one for each canto. They're very, very beautiful, and she was quite inspired by medieval ways of illustrating, but produces her illustrations in a really wonderful modern take. The trouble is that her illustrations are still in copyright, so in the book I couldn't include any, but William Blake's are great. Gustave Dolores, which are also well known, are great. Botticelli's are amazing. These line drawings he did, what he could pack into the shape of a line is unbelievable. And then some of the medieval or late medieval illustrations, particularly Giovanni de Paolo's illustrations of the Paradise, are really wonderful as well. But all this illustrating the Divine Comedy happened pretty soon after the publication of it, and because it's so visual, it immediately lends itself to artists.
I like the Botticelli because he feels personally involved somehow. I mean, I think, wasn't he a follower of Savonarola? So it really seems to mean something very profound to Botticelli, as well as you say, being very beautiful images. They're kind of intelligent and thought through and just wonderful, I think. But everybody brings something. I think what William Blake brings is, especially in Inferno, he brings the grotesquerie. All those the bulging muscles and the bulging eyes and the kind of excessiveness of his musculature. Really makes Inferno a very sort of wild and scary place, I think. And Gustave Doré is sort of atmospheric and brooding,
Yeah, I mean, Doré has that immediacy because it's a sort of Gothic imagination that is very accessible. But you're right about Blake. I hadn't thought about it in that way. I mean, I often feel that Blake is very Georgian in that he's part of that cartoon, the James Gilray,
like Gilray.
The sort of, well, what became the surreal, I guess, was very much part of that, and so Blake, I'm sure, would have seen Gilray and loved it, and had he been seen more, might have been loved in that way as well. So it does suit the Inferno. I mean, I guess in the Paradise, Blake is also a great colorist. And so the light of Paradise he gets in there's fewer of the Paradise illustrations because he was working on them when he died, actually. But nonetheless, some of the more completed paradisal ones, the incredible light that Blake can get. So I think he does that too.
So your favorite artist, Monica
Beisner, so Beisner.
And are they available in a book?
Yeah, you can buy. You can see a handful online because they've been exhibitions of her work, and so they've been used in publicity. Some of them, but you can buy a little postcard set, actually, 100 postcards, which is pretty cheap, actually. Given what it is, and enjoy them that way. But because her work is still shown, whenever there's a Dante exhibition, normally there's some Monica's work is on show as well.
Yeah, worth checking out, very much so. I will definitely do that. Okay, I'm just looking at everything that I think we've covered rather fully. So I shall certainly look forward to seeing you at the Idler Festival, and
you too, Suzi.
We would both. Do you do any of the dancing? Have I seen you in the dance tent?
Yeah, no, I do. I love the flappers, the mud flappers, and it's because it's slightly out of my comfort zone. So I kind of sit there thinking, okay, I must seize the moment and just kind of feel the rhythm that they put across.
It's hilarious, isn't it? I mean, they do manage to bring something forth. You kind of forget yourself. So I always
and I love the way that they mix, kind of, I don't know quite what the proper term is from the 1920s music, but then they're throwing a bit of hip hop because the beat is actually the same. And so
it's
you
like hip
get
hop
what we
and
call lift.
Charleston. You know, you might do a
Charleston,
Charleston move to
Yeah.
hip hop. Yes, it's absolutely brilliant. Of many wonderful things at the Idler Festival. So I'm going to wrap up with my final 3 questions. Favorite artwork, Mark Vernon?
It's one that I enjoy with Idler trips. Again, we do these Idler retreats to a place called Lipiano on the border of Umbria and Tuscany. And nearby is the town of San Sepolcro. And in the town of San Sepolcro is one of the works of Piero della Francesca, who was from that area, The Resurrection. And it's an image of Christ stepping out of a very Roman-looking marble sarcophagus.
Is he holding a
with
flag
in his hand? Yeah, exactly.
I
and
know
looking
it.
straight
Yes.
out of the picture,
Right.
with the Tuscan landscape behind, and then 4 Roman soldiers in various states of sleep in front. And I love it. I love Piero della Francesca because he always has that mix of dynamism and stillness. You know, both are happening. So for me, it's a very transcendent kind of art. But I also love it because I think actually it captures the truth of the resurrection, which is that it's a question of perception, actually. And so this extraordinary cosmic thing could be happening right by your kind of ear as it's happening for these Roman soldiers, and that you're completely oblivious to it. So it's an incredible work. So Piero della Francesca's Resurrection.
In situ in the church. Amazing.
Well, yeah, actually, it's in that. What's even nicer is it's not in a church. He painted it in a kind of civic hall. So yes. You're in a, it's a sort of very handsome building, but nothing particularly grand. You turn a corner and suddenly is, to my mind, one of the great works of the Western tradition. Which Aldous Huxley said was the greatest work of Western art as well. So it wasn't just me.
Incredible. Oh, I'll have to go. Book of Shame. Do you have one?
I've never read any Charles Dickens.
Somebody else said that as well. Somebody else, I think, was it Henry Jeffreys, who I interviewed? I think he's never read Great Expectations, even though he lives right there by the marshes. Oh my gosh, how have you avoided that? That's incredible. And it's now starting to sound deliberate. So what's going on?
Well, you're right. I mean, it has become a bit of a thing to almost, to not now, so that I can use it for its slight shock value amongst writers. I don't know. It's partly because of this thing about, I did Lit Sciences and thought I couldn't write, so I didn't read so much fiction, and I've always read more non-fiction. But I don't know. I should just pick one up one day and just read it. And get over my, I suppose I have this slight prejudice. It's because he's one of these writers that you feel you've read even when you haven't. And so you feel like you know what's in the book. So it's become a bit bound up with that for me too. There's so much I feel I should or want to read. But he's a great writer.
Adaptations.
Great Expectations, you think?
Well, I do think Great Expectations, but I meant adaptations. Have you seen things on the telly and films and things like that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oliver Twist and so on. They're so familiar. You feel like already anyway.
Yeah. I mean, his work changed a lot. So Oliver Twist is quite early on, and I think when you read them, they're different to what you expect, as you could imagine. It's not like the musical sort of everybody kind of dancing around and singing. I think I would recommend Great Expectations because it's not one of the super long ones. And it's not one of the ones that has, the Dickensian flourishes of endless description. And it's a pretty cracking story. And I think, again, it's the sort of Bildungsroman kind of thing. So I think that would be the one to go for. It's not overly long, and it's got those sort of classic scenes and characters that are really, really interesting. So that would be it. Or keep it as a book of shame. That's fine too.
No, I know your tip is good, and I should take you up on it and follow that through. So maybe not by the Idler Festival, but before long. Okay, great.
Oh, okay. Well, let me know when you've read it, and we'll discuss. We'll go for a drink or something. And finally, have you ever had any funny or bizarre feedback on any aspect of your work?
Well, the thing that came to mind actually was, I remember, you know how, at the back of the book you have like a little ortho biog, and in one of the books, I can't remember which one now, but the person who'd written the biog made a big deal about how I lived in South London, and I suddenly realised that living in South London had a kind of, I don't know if it was a slightly dangerous aura, or it was sort of a bit terra incognita, there'd be dragons or something. And I've always remembered this. It somehow lent me street cred. So now whenever, when you say where you're from, I always say South London, and half wait for some sort of intrigued feedback. I've lived in South London for decades, so and I much prefer buses to tubes and things like that. So it feels like home to me. But
a few years ago, there was a festival, a music festival on Blackheath called On Blackheath, very imaginatively, and Rag and Bone Man came to sing, and he was absolutely brilliant, but he appeared to be frightened of the audience. He was doing this. Wow, South London, you go easy on me, South London. I've not been here before. And it was really.
I do remember the first time. Funny enough, I used to have a friend that a long time ago lived in the street that I now live in, and I do remember coming to visit him once, and getting the tube and then getting a bus and then having to walk, and it did feel a bit like, where am I going? But yeah.
Wow. I mean, in terms of sort of bizarre feedback, it's not really an author biog thing. But when I got the job at the Independent on Sunday, I was deputy literary editor, and there was a little write-up in the bookseller that week. There was a new literary editor at the Independent on Sunday. Her name is Suzi Fay. Yes, that is her name. And I thought, what does that mean? That's all it said. Clearly there was something strange about that. So
but it's rather a good name for a biog. For a
it's
byline.
Nice and short. It's very good for a byline.
It does have a certain aura. It does, I think.
Yeah.
Funny enough, the chap that I came to visit in the street that I live now, he's a journalist, and his name was Nick Speed. And I always thought that was quite a good name for a journalist, Nick Speed.
Brilliant.
You want to read his work.
That is very good. I've always, 3 syllables. It's got a Z in it, got a Y in it.
Yeah.
It's pretty good. So anyway, right, you have your homework. So you'll be preparing for the Idler Festival, which is coming up. But after that, you have a date with the big CD, the big Charles Dickens. You'll be reading Great Expectations. You're not afraid of a big book. I mean, look, it's incredible, isn't it? You've done so much, reading of Dante. I don't think Dickens will prove any kind of intellectual challenge.
Yeah,
you'll enjoy it.
I will, and thanks for loving Dante, because I love loving talking about Dante as well. So it's a joy to share these things.
It certainly is.
Some of that has communicated in our conversation.
So your book is, I've got it on my Kindle. I normally hold up a book, so I'm not going to hold up a Kindle, but it is Dante's Divine Comedy, a guide for the spiritual journey, and I thoroughly recommend it. And I really like the sound of your friendship book as well. Maybe I'll check that one out. You have been exceedingly friendly, and you have guided us on this literary journey. So thank you very much, Mark Vernon, for joining me in the book bag.
Thank you too, Suzi.
I shall see you soon.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for watching. Do check out the Idler Festival, which is coming up. Do check out all of Mark's books and check me out the next time I turn up with another brilliant author to chat to. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.